This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's Wednesday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Today, we're going to be taking a look at cards that have rummage effects. The name of this term comes from Rummaging Goblin, and it's an effect that is pretty similar to looting, but there is one key difference. If you're rummaging, you have to discard the card first, and then you draw another card. With looting, you draw, and then decide what to discard. So, it isn't an effect that grants you card advantage, but it's one that helps you fill your graveyard, while also improving your card quality and ripping through your deck. Rummaging is largely a red ability, though as we'll see in this video, blue sometimes got the effect in the earlier days of Magic. For this video, I did expand the definition of rummage a little bit beyond what it does on Rummaging Goblin. Instead of limiting it only to effects where you discard a single card and draw a single card, I also included any effect that has you discard any number of cards up front, and after that you draw the same number of cards. Those type of effects are basically rummaging several times. It's kind of funny, I completed this script before Strixhaven previews began, but there's a lot of rummaging in that set as all learn cards give you the option to rummage, so now it feels like an even more opportune time to talk about rummaging. Alright, before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A top 8 at a Pro Tour, Players Tour, Mythic Championship, Mythic Invitational, Legacy or Vintage Championship is worth 2 points, and a top 8 at a Grand Prix or Magic Fest is worth 1 point. Alright, let's get to the list. At number 10 it is Sarkhan Fireblood, a planeswalker with a +1 that lets you rummage. He also has an additional +1 that gives you 2 mana of any color, but you can only spend it on dragons, and he has a -7 that gives you a dominating board presence of 4 5/5 dragons. Sarkhan gained all of his points in standard blue-red spells decks. These decks utilized Arclight Phoenix and Niv-Mizzet Perun, and the Fireblood had nice synergy with both of them. It could throw the Phoenix in the graveyard, and it could help you cast the powerful Niv-Mizzet significantly earlier. It doesn't have any points since rotating out of standard. At number 9, it is TOLARIAN Wind. I mentioned in the intro that rummaging is mostly a red effect these days, but that hasn't always been the case, and TOLARIAN Wind is an example of that. TOLARIAN Wind lets you discard your whole hand and then draw that many cards. While that kind of effect will sometimes not really do what you want it to, like if you draw it really late, it does have some very powerful potential in decks that really want to rapidly load up their graveyard. Just casting this on turn 2 is a powerful way to set up graveyard decks. TOLARIAN Wind's points all came from the extended Ichorid deck, a deck that really loved to rapidly load the graveyard and then reanimate a bunch of Ichorids every turn until the opponent was dead, and TOLARIAN Wind was pretty useful in that type of deck. The deck also ran a pretty significant number of cards with Dredge, like Golgari Grave Troll. If you discard the Troll to TOLARIAN Wind and then replace one of those draws with Dredge, it's going to give you a ton of graveyard fuel. TOLARIAN Wind doesn't have any points since 2008. At number 8, it is Drowned RUSALKA, another blue rummage card. It has the same number of total points as TOLARIAN Wind, but I gave it the edge because it has a Pro Tour top 8. This little 1-drop has a nice activated ability that lets you sacrifice a creature to rummage. This effect can include itself too, which is always nice. Like TOLARIAN Wind, Drowned RUSALKA was played in extended Dredge decks. The Dredge decks it was part of ran Bloodghast, and combining the RUSALKA and the Bloodghast was pretty effective, whether the Bloodghast was the creature you sacrificed or the card you discarded. Drowned RUSALKA doesn't have any points since 2009. At number 7, it is Rixmati Reveler. Because of Spectacle, the Reveler really has 2 modes. The first is simply that it's a 2-mana 2/2 that rummages, but if you get Spectacle going, you can pay 2 generic, a black, and a red for the Reveler, but get a way upgraded into the battlefield trigger. You now discard your hand and draw 3 cards. Now, that effect won't always be upgraded, but it will be pretty often in the late game. Incidentally, if a card only had an effect where you discarded and drew a fixed number of cards, I didn't consider it rummaging, because effects like that net you a card and are inherently different. So if that's all the Reveler could do, I wouldn't have it here. But the non-spectacle version of the card does rummage, and that's what allowed it to make the list. The Reveler gained all of its points in standard Rakdos aggro decks, where it was just a reasonable creature you could play early, and then in the later part of the game you could use it to reload your hand, something that aggro decks often need to finish off opponents. It doesn't have any points since it rotated out of standard. And number 6, it's Seasoned Pyromancer. It was printed in Modern Horizons, which means that it completely skips Standard and Pioneer and is only legal in Modern, Legacy, and Vintage. The Pyromancer has quite the Enter the Battlefield ability. It lets you rummage twice, and for each non-land card you discard, you get a 1/1 elemental. You can also exile the Seasoned Pyromancer from your graveyard to make some more elementals. In Modern, it has found its way into aggressive red decks that have a graveyard sub-theme, like Death Shadow, Is It Phoenix, and Hollow One. It's also gained points in red legacy decks like Painter Servant Combo and Mono Red Stompy. It doesn't have any points since 2020, but I think it will gain more points in both Modern and Legacy in the future. And number 5, it is Compulsion, the third and final blue rummage card to make the list. This enchantment comes with 2 abilities. One of them lets you rummage, and the other lets you sacrifice it to draw a card. In black, it was played in a blue-green deck that heavily utilized both Threshold and Madness, and Compulsion was good at helping you with both because it would allow you to discard cards while also loading your graveyard. In Standard, it was played in decks that were a little less focused on those mechanics, but it was still being played in decks that liked to discard cards like Arrogant Worm and Circular Logic, and they gave it some serious additional value. Compulsion doesn't have any points since it rotated out of Standard. And number 4, it is Collective Defiance. This modal spell has one option that lets you rummage your whole hand. It also has 2 other options, one which does 4 to a creature, and another which does 3 to an opponent. Unlike most modal cards, you can actually choose all of these options if you're willing to pay the additional mana for Escalate. If you do, you end up with a 5 mana spell that kills a creature, burns the opponent, loads your graveyard, and helps you draw more meaningful spells, which isn't too bad. Collective Defiance gained all of its points in Standard, appearing in both mono-red aggro and blue-red spells. Doesn't have any points since rotating out of Standard. And number 3, it is Cavalier of Flame. This guy has an incredibly wordy text box, and buried in there is the ability to rummage as many times as you want when he enters the battlefield. In addition to that, the Cavalier has a pretty nice body for 5 mana, it can pump your whole board and give it haste, and when it dies, it does damage to your opponents and their planeswalkers equal to the number of lands in your graveyard, and if you discarded lands to the rummage effect, you can make sure that will actually do something. Cavalier of Flame gained all of its points in Standard, and they all came in Fires of Invention decks. These decks stopped paying mana for spells once Fires was in play, so cards with nice mana sinks were pretty attractive, and obviously Cavalier of Flame is one of those. You can pump all of your unused mana into it to make your board pretty scary. Ultimately, Fires got banned, and Cavalier of Flame didn't get any more points before it rotated out of Standard. And number 2, it is Insolent Neonate. This 1 mana 1/1 with Menace is hard to block in the early game, and then in the late game he can give himself up to help you rummage. It saw only a tiny bit of play in Standard in Rakdos aggro decks. Modern, though, is where it has really thrived over the last several years, where it's a key card in Dredge decks, since the rummage effect lets you both discard something with Dredge and dig deeper into your deck, and you can even choose to Dredge right away with whatever it is you discarded. He paired particularly well with Bridge from Below, as the Bridge would give you a 2/2 token, you draw a card, and put something in your graveyard that you wanted there. The Neonate was already being played in modern Bridge from Below decks before Hogak got on the scene, and during the time that Hogak was legal in the format, the Neonate went along for the ride, amassing even more points. Hogak and Bridge from Below, of course, were ultimately banned, and graveyard decks have been dealt a major blow in Modern in general, with the additional banning of Faithless Looting, but I still think it's likely that the Neonate will be part of future graveyard decks in the format. At number 1, it's Nahiri, the Harbinger. Nahiri is a pretty powerful planeswalker who starts with high loyalty. If you play her and use her +2 ability, she's already at 6, and that's a lot. In addition to helping you improve your draws with a rummage effect, she can also remove a number of different types of permanents. Nahiri also has a nice ultimate, which, in the right deck, can search up really frightening creatures who can end the game in a hurry. She was played in a lot of different Standard decks, but Mardu Vehicles is where she was played the most. Vehicles themselves are actually a pretty big part of why she was played so much in Standard, because she could exile the problematic ones, and there were a few of them. She has seen some play in Modern too, most frequently in Jeskai control decks, which usually run something pretty spicy to search up with their ultimate, like Emrakul. She also has been played in Pioneer Niv Mizzet Reborn decks, where she can be a card that Niv can hit with his Enter the Battlefield ability, and if she comes down before Niv, she can also search him up, which is pretty sweet. Nahiri doesn't have any points since 2020, but Pioneer has been pretty inactive since the beginning of the pandemic, and it seems likely she'll still be a factor there once things get back to normal. Well, those are the 10 cards that let you rummage that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. If you want to buy any of the cards featured in this video, you can find individual links for each of them that will take you to the Card Kingdom store in the description. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past MTG Top 10s, there should be a playlist on your screen shortly. And if you enjoy listening to me talk about Magic, consider subscribing to my other channel, Nitsahone History, where I talk about real-world history. Thanks for watching.